In our study of Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga, we have completed one chapter and are beginning the next, titled The Lower Triple Purusha. And before we plunge into it, briefly to place it in context, that in the previous chapter, he was describing the different worlds, gradations as if of consciousness, of relationship of consciousness with force of consciousness, Purusha and Prakriti, which form the various worlds as if in a pile. And in the description we went through in great detail the form and the nature of this physical material world, where consciousness is practically concealed. Matter, rigid form, is all that we experience. At best, consciousness emerges as a phenomenon, riding like a ripple on the material base. Above this is the vital world, where force and force of life is the prime substance and prime reality. And there, consciousness appears, exists, but is driven, is led by the impulse of life force. In the plane above, we have the world of mind, where consciousness is aware, there is an awareness, but the awareness itself is fragile, fickle, limited. And beyond this are the spiritual worlds, where consciousness comes into its own as a free creative power that can freely express itself through its energies, and the consciousness is Lord. Such is the broad framework that he described. We saw in great detail the relationships between these different worlds, how the lower emerges from the higher, but also how these are formed in us as human beings, where he describes planes of our being which are formed. So we have a physical body formed of the physical matter, and then we have a vital sheath and a mental sheath, and above that still higher gradations of our spiritual. And the reason that we are not conscious of those other worlds is because our consciousness is exclusively fixated in the material body and looking out through material senses. And the vital world impacts us profoundly, even shapes most of our drives, but it acts on us through the vital body and from there into the physical. The mental world fills us with a whole realm of thoughts, and we have constantly, unknown to ourselves, a sharing of thoughts and ideas across. But this action is in the mental body, and from there reflects in the physical. But since we live almost entirely in the physical body with the physical senses, we are not aware of all this, which is happening in us, and are aware only of the little part that reflects in our most surface layers. This was the background of the previous chapter. And in this present chapter, Sri Aurobindo will give us this big picture now. What is it like to see the full spectrum of reality from above? And from there, when we look at our current life, what does it look like? And then we will understand how the current view, particularly of science, relates to this larger perspective, and in what way it is transitioning already, but will continue to transition to awaken to something higher. That will be the broad framework of the next few pages, which will lead eventually to a deeper understanding of our status in these three lower bodies, and in what way we can begin the process of freeing ourselves from this exclusive hypnosis in the physical body. And having made that first separation, the next chapter is titled The Ladder of Self Transcendence. As if through small steps, our consciousness can then begin to rise up a ladder to free itself from all its limitations and rise to the poise of mastery from where it can experience not only the whole spectrum of cosmos, but freely wield its possibilities as creator in the universe. So this is the framework, the big picture, and now we enter the chapter titled The Lower Triple Purusha. If we were only merely living body, our objective perspective would say, this is all, there is nothing else. But because we are soul first, we realize that this is not all, there is something more. And there are two angles he gives, that this is not the real truth and this is not the whole knowledge. And there are two different ways of looking at the world. You can look at the world and say, all this which I think it is, life is like this, matter is like this, we are a body which is thinking. It's not the real truth. The real truth is something totally different. Science itself, as it goes deeper, comes to this recognition. Matter itself, it says, yes, you think this is matter, but actually this is molecule. No, you think it's molecule, it's actually atom. No, it's not atom, it's subatomic particle. No, it's not particle, it's pure energy. No, it's wave. No, it's particle. No, it's wave and particle at the same time. It keeps layering that there's a more real truth behind. That's one way you can look at materially, or even psychologically. We can say, it appears as if it's just this, but it feels as if behind that there is an intelligence, something trying to express itself. I feel the flower, but in the beauty of the flower, there is something hidden which I cannot explain purely from the physical form of it. There are entire studies to articulate and capture the sense of beauty through the appearance of form. So they call it the science of beauty. And after all the analysis is done from a material perspective, from a measured mathematical view, the only thing they can say is beauty has something to do with symmetry. But you cannot get beyond that. Beauty seems to be inherently something which is non-material, not form, and yet needing form to express. I've shared this many times before, but in this context, it's worth repeating. In the Indian tradition, there is a definition of beauty given by Kalidasa, which transcends all these very reductionist views. And he defines beauty like this. He says, in Sanskrit, I will paraphrase, from moment to moment, that which reveals always newness, that is the essence of beauty. So when you look at something which is beautiful, there's something fresh, there's something new, and your eyes are drawn. But if that newness finished with that first gaze, after a while you'll get bored and look away. Now it's no more new. But the nature of beauty is that from one moment to the next, there's something new and ever new, that you keep on looking and say, oh wow, oh how wonderful, oh wow. And you turn away, but you want to come back and look and gaze. And so that sense of newness that glows out and unfolds, and something ever new, never needing to repeat, that's the essence of beauty. And yet we are looking at a form. What is that other thing which makes it beautiful? And you are unable to capture it. You can feel it, but you cannot reduce it to your material, sensory, mental terms. You have to accept there is a deeper sense or a deeper power which gives you that sense of perception of beauty, or which is the soul or source of that beauty. And this is true not only of physical form, it is equally true of emotions. There are beautiful emotions, beautiful relationships, or beautiful ideas. And it is fascinating in the realm of ideas. This is reflected in the world of physics or mathematics. There is a spontaneous recognition that that which is true must be beautiful. And there's a very famous statement by one of the scientists who says that truth is beauty, beauty, truth. Why? And that's our experience. When something is shown and deep within you, you have the resonance of the truth of it, you have also the sense of, wow, what a beautiful idea. And you recognize that there is a deeper truth behind which continues to glow out, always revealing a sense of newness to the mind. It's so elegant, it's so beautiful, it's so perfectly stated, so beautifully formed, and this sense of truth behind. And in both of these words, beauty or truth, what we're glimpsing behind the form and appearance is something more essential, and we will now use the word divine. Because the nature of the divine is to unfold always something new, something more, unendingly, because it is infinite potential and not a finite static piece. And as infinite potential, it reveals at each moment something which is never repeated. And therefore, as it flows out, the universe grows, universe progresses, we grow, truth grows. And so at any point in time, you can capture a snapshot and say, now I've got it, this is true. And you articulate the truth and freeze it. The universe continues to grow because the divine continues to unfold. And very quickly there's a gap. And your truth now, suddenly you say, it's become false. And again you try to capture a new snapshot. Yes, I've got the greater truth. It's interesting when you look at it this way. And soul is that. And so because he is soul and not merely a living body, man can never for long remain satisfied of this first view of his existence. You may be satisfied for a while, but eventually something unfolds, something grows, things grow, and you realize something is missing. The other word we use, this is not the real truth or the whole knowledge. The other side, the other way of looking at it is, this is what we see is one side of the knowledge, there is a greater knowledge. And we have to now grow in knowledge to get to the whole. His subjective being is full of hints and inklings of reality beyond, of realities beyond. It is open to the sense of infinity and immortality. So subjectively, objectively we may say this is all that I can see and prove. But subjectively I know, I feel there is more. And what are the things which we sense subjectively? And he lists a series of them. And it's interesting to dwell on each of these and see how they form or how they resonate within us. So first he says, hints and inklings of realities beyond, it is open to the sense of infinity. That every time you have something which is finite, you miss something more. And the moment you have something more, you miss something more. Why? Because there is the sense of infinity which is calling you always. Therefore, you are never satisfied. Even if you enjoy food, you eat all the food you want, at some point you say, I wish I could have more. You have numbers in wealth, in a bank account perhaps, numbers so big that you cannot even calculate, and yet something more. So the sense of infinity which is at the backdrop, in contrast to it, the finite appears always to suggest something is missing. What is that? And since I don't recognize what it is, I'm always trying to grow the finite. But behind that is the sense of infinity. And where do you touch it? You go to the top of a mountain, and suddenly you feel calm, you feel complete, because momentarily to your physical gaze, you have touched a first glimpse of the infinite. And you feel so calm and reassured, and all those desires and cravings become satiated, at least for a while. Or you sit before the ocean, or you're in the middle of the ocean on a ship, and you look out at that vast, and for a while you feel your heart is full, and you don't need more, you don't crave more, because you've briefly touched something of that infinity. And you sense it, but you don't know what it is you're sensing. Or the sense of immortality. And this takes a different form. It is in the extension in time. You have the sense that I'm never going to die. In the Mahabharata, this question is asked of Yudhishthira. He is the wise one. So he's asked this question, what is the most surprising thing in human behavior? And Yudhishthira says, although everyone knows that someday they have to die, everyone behaves as if they will never die. Interesting. Why is that contradiction? Because somewhere inside we know we are immortal. And to accept mortality, to accept an end, is to accept a falsehood. And we feel immediately a reaction. No, it's not true. And yet on a very superficial level, materially, all the evidence of your science says, you're going to die. Why don't you accept it? And even if you do accept, superficially you accept, what do? I will do something so great people will remember me for all time. Isn't that what you're trying to do when you try to become famous or great? Or you want to create a monument or an object or a piece of art that will last beyond your little time. Or you create an endowment or an institution with your name on it, or with your parents' name, or whatever it is. The idea is to attempt to extend the name into time. Because somewhere inside we have the sense of immortality, but because it leaks in, hints and inklings leak in, and we don't know what it is or why that is more true and this is unreal, it takes these forms, strange forms. And then he says, it is easily convinced of other worlds, higher possibilities of being, larger fields of experience for the soul. So let's look at all three. Other worlds, easily convinced of other worlds. If I tell you that there is another world where such a thing is possible, even though your material experience says, no, this is all, somewhere in the mind at least, yes, in my world of imagination, it is possible. At the very least. And maybe my world of imagination is actually possible eventually in time, or on some other planet, or maybe some other world which to me in the imagination is so vivid. The sense of other worlds or other realities is inherent, and that is why when physics enters this very speculative game, which actually makes no sense at all materially, the game that says at every moment the universe splits into so many options and there are many universes at the same time, with each option creating its own universe, physically it is so ridiculous. And yet that same physical scientist is coming up with this theory and you accept, saying, yes, because somewhere inside you, you know it should be possible to have other experiences. And the physical scientist himself does not realize the contradiction of his statements. On one side he says this is all, on the other side he says there are other worlds. Where? Oh, they split somehow in some metaphysical realm of physical reality. It doesn't make sense. But we accept because this is the reality. There are in fact all these other worlds and higher grades of worlds and consciousness. Then he speaks of easily convinced of other worlds and easily convinced of higher possibilities of being. The idea that I need not be stuck with what I am, but that I can be more than what I am. And we're easily convinced of it. Imagine you tell that to a child, you're growing up and one day you will do this. You will be great. You will have great capacity, great whatever. And the child says, yes. How do you know? If it was purely a material reality, you would say, but this is all I'm programmed to do. This is all my genes are. This is what I'm capable of. There cannot be more. And every time that we make an effort and go beyond this norm, we are breaking this falsehood that we are a product of genes. And all this is possible because something within sees and knows that there can be a higher being, a higher experience that I can have. So possibilities of being, and being not just physically as in this example, but also possibilities of being intellectually. That in my mind I can amplify not only the intelligence, the power of conception, the power of perception, the power of revelation, that I can see realities which are greater. And it is such a person who is able to see a larger truth that we call drashta, the seer, or kavi, the poet, in the higher intuitive sense of the term. And so there is a power of mind which goes beyond mere intelligence, that can see truth and in vast chunks and articulate and give form with force. There's also a spiritual possibility of being beyond, where you can live in the totality of this universe of space and time, because that's the true nature of your soul. And so everything here is as if turning towards that and is willing to recognize any possibility all the way to that. And the last, he says, larger fields of experience for the soul. And this is what it would come to eventually. You live in the full possibility of your soul's experience of the world. And what might such a soul experience of the world be like? Well, one obvious in the context of our discussion so far, you experience the whole universe within you. You experience all time unfolding within your totality. But also you can zoom in and focus on a particular experience through this body, through this mind, and look at the whole universe, but in a wider spectrum of perception. What is our current perception? We have 5 senses. Each of these senses has a very narrow band of seeing, experiencing. So let's say our sight has this very narrow band from the red to the violet, narrow band of frequencies. And with our instruments, we know there are an infinity more of ranges of electromagnetic waves, all as if frequencies of light, which our retina cannot see. A snake can see into the infrared. Butterflies can see into the ultraviolet. Why can't we? And if we could, by some greater power, now begin to expand our sight to widen this zone, what would the world appear like? How many millions of colors, more rich, more varied, would be part of our experience of the spectrum? And when we would look at the flower, we would see not only this form, but we would see with the X-ray sight and ultraviolet and beyond and other frequencies, and we would see it much more richly, deeply, multifaceted way. And if we could do that with all of our senses, what would that be like? If all our senses extended into infinity, what would that be like? All of these are as if glimpses one can have of what might be possible for the soul's experience of the universe. And still, this is only based on senses, where I am meeting another by some intermediary. But the true nature of soul is not objectivity and separation. The true nature of soul is oneness in the essential. So the soul's experience of flower will be not just so many senses more rich, it will be the softness and sweetness and the tenderness of the flowers opening out. It will experience that in the flower, which expresses itself as the subtle perfume of the flower. It will experience that in the flower, in that beauty and harmony which glows out as beauty through the physical form of the flower. It will experience the plant and the force of its life and the joy of its surging energy as it turns to grow and burst out through flowers and fruit. And the experience of the soul, therefore, will be fundamentally different, not merely exaggeration of our senses, but one of deep immersion in identification. And at that point, when you experience oneness through separation, we call it love. A deep, profound love is the soul's experience of the universe. And as it turns to gaze on the universe, it experiences oneness with the whole. And so a love that pours from the whole universe to it and that bursts out from it into the whole universe. And this deep, profound flow of love and all relationships with all forms and objects, such would be the possibilities of the soul's experience. And when our mind turns to a possibility which is deeper, it is in this direction, but not recognizing the full possibility which is still waiting because it cannot imagine. It is beyond its power of conception. So it is easily convinced of other worlds, higher possibilities of being, larger fields of experience for the soul. And in contrast, science gives us the objective truth of existence and the superficial knowledge of our physical and vital being. But we feel that there are truths beyond, which possibly through the cultivation of our subjective being and the enlargement of its powers may come to lie more and more open to us. So here are these two facets of our quest. What we have today as the physical science, it gives you this it gives you the objective truth of existence. What do you see objectively? What do you recognize and validate objectively? And then a little bit superficial knowledge of the physical and vital being. Your body is made of these processes, these hormones, these chemical structures, and your energy is the product of these biological processes which extract energy and express it. Yes, true, but very superficially. In fact, as you go deeper into biological processes, you discover very quickly that it doesn't work. It doesn't explain everything. It doesn't describe a whole range of experiences. For example, the energy which your physical body can produce by burning sugars is quantifiable, measurable. But in fact, a person in a state of exaltation can produce so much more energy that it will be far more than the biology has. And all of these come into domains of paranormal phenomena. In the training which is given to yogis or lamas living in the Himalayas, they are taught to be able to produce heat from the body in a way that they can live bare-bodied in the snow, lie down in the snow, go to sleep, wake up in the morning and continue to walk for 100 kilometers in barefoot in the snow with only a little food that they're carrying in their backpack. They eat a little bit, go to sleep again in the snow, get up and walk again. The calories from that food or the stored calories in your fat are not enough to produce so much heat. Very simply. And what this shows is what we have measured of the life force in the body as calorific products is a superficial part. There is much deeper reality of our life force, our vital being. And the same can be said of our physical being also. The physical body itself is capable of things which are unexplainable by science. So, for that, we need to tap something else. What do we do there? We feel There are truths beyond which, possibly through the cultivation of our subjective being and the enlargement of its powers, may come to lie more and more open to us. There's something more we feel, and if you cultivate yourself, if you grow somehow subjectively, you might be able to reach it. That's the instinct, that's the intuition that we have. Every child has at least sometimes, not just once, attempted to will an event to happen. Do you remember doing that as children? Something has to happen, and it's as if you put all your energy, and sometimes it happens. And when it happens, what do? You replicate the same thing you did again and again. And if at that time what you did was in a certain form of prayer or a particular invocation or a particular gesture, you will keep repeating that gesture, hoping to make it happen. What do you see in this instinct and in this process? The first glimpse of the formation of magic or occultism. The exercise of your will with some process and procedure to compel circumstances as you wish. How did it come into you? It was an instinct that knew I should be able to do this and did whatever it could at that moment with the tools and capacity that it had. And maybe it was a coincidence, maybe not. There's a part that doubts. But somewhere you know that it's doable, and therefore you are convinced, even if it happened by coincidence, I should be able to do it. And if I can enlarge that capacity, then I should be able to do it every time. Very simple instinct in all, but it's subjective. When the knowledge of this world is ours, we've studied all this, completed all that matter could teach. When the knowledge of this world is ours, we are irresistibly impelled to seek for the knowledge of other states of existence beyond. And that is the reason why an age of strong materialism and skepticism is always followed by an age of occultism, of mystical creeds, of new religions, and profounder seekings after the infinite and the divine. What an extraordinary observation. And the logic of it is impeccable. You recognize that the moment you've completed this domain of exploration, you recognize that it is insufficient. Because there's a whole realm of phenomena, or at least subjectively perceived possibilities, which are not only not explained, but inaccessible by this very narrow knowledge of matter. All of your physical science says this is all that is possible and nothing more. And your inner part says, oh, but of course not, so much more should be possible. A lot of that gets expressed in our imaginations, in our art, in our speculations of philosophy, mathematics, even physics. Consider one of the speculations, they speak of a black hole, so much gravitation that matter collapses and it becomes like a link point and it must burst out somewhere else as a white hole. What a ridiculous idea from a purely physical perspective. And yet the mind wants to play with it. And as long as it can justify this through the mathematics, and a very superficial mathematics at that, then you say, yes, it should be possible. And you even hope that it should be possible. And the whole realm of science fiction opens up. You will enter the black hole here, come out at the other end of the universe through a white hole and travel great distances. Why? Because it should be possible. And if somehow it is proved that the black hole is none of these things and it was just one of the mathematical speculations, you are disappointed. And now you look for other means to travel great distances because it should be possible. And this physical reality and the understanding of it is too shallow. There must be more. So the moment you've stopped, you know there has to be more, and so you start going beyond it to other realms of knowledge. We are irresistibly impelled to seek for the knowledge of other states of existence beyond. In the very edge For me, the most fascinating part of the scientific quest is what will be called the cutting edge. The very nature of cutting edge is that it is meeting the unknown. And when you dwell on the cutting edge, every time you come across things for which there's no explanation, and in order to be able to justify that such a thing is possible without current explanation, you have to expand your knowledge, enter a deeper or a higher realm of knowledge. And that's the most satisfying thing. To stop with what is known and say this is all is the most suffocating feeling. There must be more. You can't stop with this little knowledge. So it's always followed, he says, by an age of, and he discusses four broad categories: occultism, mystical creeds, new religions, and profounder seekings after the infinite and the divine. You will recall, those of you who are following the classes of the Life Divine on Sunday, Sri Aurobindo describes the 4 entry points through which nature prepares humanity to open out to deeper realities of the spirit. The first he puts there as religion, second occultism, third spiritual philosophy, and fourth direct spiritual experience. And here you will find all 4 listed, a slightly different order. First occultism, then mystical creeds. So in the mystical creed, it's much more a belief system and more a philosophy of some kind. And then religions, and then the more profound seeking after the infinite and the divine. Why this change of order here? In fact, there's a very clear logic from religion to occultism, because religion has almost a superficial mechanical character. Occultism opens you to your own deeper ranges of powers, and then at that point you've still not brought in mind. When the mind comes in, it rises above and tries to organize it into a philosophy and a spiritual philosophy, and separate from all this is the deeper reality which is of the spirit. So that sequence is quite clear. But here the sequence actually is slightly different, because occultism is nothing but an extension of physical science. When physical science comes to a limit and says, here matter ends, and yet knowledge and technology continues, you've slipped into the domain of occultism, or we will say occult science. Or putting another way, that which was earlier called occult science, as current physical science grows, it co-opts and brings it into current science. So for example, realities of invisible things like radio waves, which were completely denied by the most materialistic science. What you see and touch is all that exists. And then to say, oh, there are actually waves of electromagnetism which are immeasurable, unobservable. And if there are waves, there have to be a medium. Which medium? Again, it's not in the air, it's not in matter. A subtle, rarefied, non-material medium. You have already got into a speculative zone, which is non-material. And that is the basis of your technology of a mobile phone and communication. And if you had gone with a mobile phone 150 years ago, before radio waves became accepted as a reality, they would have said you're a magician, you're doing black magic. So what was occultism then now becomes part of the physical science as it widens its scope. And still there's a point where it fails, because its starting point is you should be able to reduce all things to a material, quantifiable and fixed, rigid basis at least. So your radio waves are, yes, electromagnetic phenomena in an underlying ether, and then they removed the ether and then they called it ripples of energy in empty space, not explained but described. But still, it is material, but of a grade which is more subtle. But you cross a threshold where you have paranormal phenomena, and again measured in the laboratory, where a person projects an idea or an energy into another, and this other person is put in a room which is completely shielded to all electromagnetic frequencies. And this person from outside the room is able to influence the states of the other person. So now it is not electromagnetic. What do you call it? And you see, over time, the vocabulary has to co-opt a phenomena. So in Russia, if you go back 40 years ago, they called it bioenergy. Somehow it is an energy put out by the human body, but it's an energy. And as energy, we can include it in science. But we don't know what kind of energy, but it's energy. Today, because energy had a problem with science, energy means you should be able to measure it and reduce it and quantify it. You can't, at least not this energy. So today, what they call it, the term which is increasingly acceptable is biofield. And that bypasses the problem of science's vocabulary. Now it's a field, and as a field, it can influence other fields. It's biofield, it comes from your biology, it's not there automatically in dead matter. And it somehow can do stuff which we can measure. And now we are happy because we fitted it into the little box of the scientific vocabulary and concepts. And after that, the scientist is happy to explore his biofield experiments until he discovers the experiments cannot be explained. I share one example I've given a few months ago here, perhaps, but where a person heals another by a certain transmission of energy, we can still say biofield or even bioenergy. The healing process is recorded by a video camera. You have registered an effect in the cells or the patient on which the healing is done. Now you remove the healer, make a copy of the video camera tape recording, transfer it to a video file, transfer the file across the internet into another computer. So nothing physically common, okay, except the informational pattern of the video recording. That's all that's there on the other side. There you play it on the television screen and put a cellular sample in front, and it receives a similar result as the healer doing the healing. How do you explain this? You've removed all the physical connections to the healer. How do you explain this? And here the physical framework of science fails. And so either the scientist turns away, I don't want this, I will ruin my reputation, I will lose my prominence, or as a few scientists do, they continue to plod on, explore and publish, but it never gets quoted, never gets publicity in the medium, in the newspapers, but it is hardcore science because it's done with the strictest methods of science, with all the double-blind tests and the lot. But if you accept this is true, which you have to accept with the evidence, the implications are so enormous. It means that there is something which can be transmitted completely free of matter, which therefore does not exist on a location but is available everywhere, and you need only tap into it from where you are to get that result. That's what it implies. What was transmitted? The experience of the healer doing his healing, which has gone through this medium from a recording on a memory card, transmission through the internet. What has remained there? Nothing physically. And yet you reproduce the same result there. It means what happened here is available there. The implications are that there is a domain of reality where the sense of space breaks down. And an energy or an intention can actually be transmitted or recreated or invoked independent of space and even independent of time. There are a whole series of experiments in what is called remote viewing, where a person is asked to remote view what will be picked up tomorrow at random by a group of people. And he does the remote view now, and the thing is replicated, is confirmed later. So in an example of a remote viewer, he was in Japan, and he describes how the next day he was to do a remote viewing in public. And the method was, there were 7 envelopes of target locations. They were to be sorted, someone to pick up at random, sealed envelopes. Then he will go out on his motorcycle or car at a great distance, open the envelope, and whatever location it describes, he will go to and reach at a particular fixed time. Let's say it is at 10 a.m. So they've mixed up all these. An envelope is picked up by someone from the audience, it's taken out. The only person who knows what is the location is the person who's on the location at 10 a.m. And now the remote viewer is told, please remote view where he is and tell us. Now, nobody knows except that one person. The remote viewer says, all right, I could do it now, but to do it in front of television cameras with all the stress and tension of lights and heat and emotions, I might not do so well. So last night, when I was in my hotel room, I relaxed and did a remote view of what will be picked up today at 10 a.m. Where will the person be? And he's already done his remote viewing. He pulls out an envelope and says, here's my result. And he reveals the picture he has drawn. The person who's there takes photos of his area, he comes back and they match. You could predict the night before what selection would be made. And there are many other such experiments where the perception or the power to engage seems to cross time, not just space. And it suggests that there is a domain of consciousness and operation of consciousness and senses of consciousness which can transcend space and time. That you have a power of perception which is not bound to your physical biology but can directly see and, at least for a little range, extend beyond space and time. And all of this is pure physical, scientifically tested, replicable, double-blind, with all the strictest requirements of laboratory science. So either you accept this is so, or you remain bound in your little denial. There's this image of the ostrich. When it senses danger which it cannot manage, it sticks his head into the sand, hoping that the danger vanishes because he can't see it. But that's what a lot of scientists are stuck with, and they remain stuck in their little domain. So, we start looking beyond. When the knowledge of this world is ours, we are irresistibly impelled to seek for the knowledge of other states of existence beyond. We have to accept that there is an existence which is ours because we live in it, we have access to it. Can we now access it? Can we develop it? So there is a whole range of scientists, and we don't call them scientists anymore, who are not concerned with the theory, who are not concerned with what you believe. They are just interested in the application. And these are the military. And the military says, we don't care what your explanation is, we want to use this to spy on the other fellow. Let's put it to use. And one of the questions which was placed by the US military was, if you can do this, can we train people? So they developed a training program. Then they said, how do we recognize who is better at it? So they created a matrix of studies, of parameters of human types, personality types, experiences you've had in your life. There was a whole range of some 256 parameters. And against these, they mapped out who were the most effective as remote viewers. And they found two distinct markers. And so they scoured the whole US military to look for people with these markers. These people were called separately and trained for this whole program, which then went secret. You don't care what the theory is. Let's use it. So all this really takes you to this domain of new consciousness, new possibilities. Now, in that program, those who were taken into it, they found they were changing so rapidly. Their whole worldview was changing. Their experience and relationships were changing. And often it led to great problems, including marital discord. Because they grew so much, their spouse did not grow. Suddenly they were living in other worlds or realities of other worlds, and their spouse was still in that little box. So it led to divorces. So what they did was, whenever they took new recruits for training, they would put them through a briefing. You're joining a program where your whole sense of reality will change completely, and you might end up with marital discord and even with a divorce. Sign on the paper that you accept to join. Interesting. Because what happened was, the result, they opened out to a higher reality of themselves and began to enter a process of conscious growth. And I will even use the word spiritual growth. It was not merely a vital, not merely a subtler inner mental, but the recognition that there is something which is one in which everything is held became for them more and more a vivid reality. They began to have glimpses or experiences of this, and it opened them to a spiritual possibility. So, other states of existence inevitably you come to. And so, that is the reason why an age of strong materialism and skepticism is always followed by an age of occultism first, because your science is growing out into an occult science. And I want to point to this transition particularly as the current phase we are at. Science has already hit all the limits that it could. At best, you have technological improvements of new applications or expanded scope of a current application. Artificial intelligence is more intelligent, but it is the same thing really, not a new possibility beyond that. But at the same time, we have reached the limit of reason and we have entered what we call a postmodern world, or even some people use the word transmodern world, meaning modernity has ended because it has failed, and modernity characterized by reason and the promises of reason. So, what happens in the postmodern? Subjectivism. You begin to experience things subjectively and you give it as much value or even more value than the objective. So, with the occultism, which is more on the realm of science because it's replicable, you have a mixture of these mystical creeds, belief systems, and subjective belief systems. In this domain of the subjective opening, all kinds of things come up, all kinds of mystical creeds. And they're mystical because they belong to a domain behind the veil, which is secret. And then there are belief systems, which may or may not be valid or half valid or limited and narrow in their beliefs. And new religions, you will see in history, every now and then there are these little bursts of new religions. They always follow a period of strong skepticism and denial. An excellent example is the phase which is post-communist. In Russia, you had this very hard, sharp cutting off, materialistic, communistic imposition that came with the Bolshevik Revolution. It was so hard, materialistic, and yet the people have a mystical turn and opening in the culture. What they did was they co-opted their mystical things in the framework of science. And so they had this bioenergy and biopsychology and all kinds of experiments which were done in the laboratory. As long as they were in the laboratory with military applications, it was science. So the mysticism was accepted. Out-of-body experience in the laboratory for military spying, accepted. So the KGB had, at a given time, according to the CIA records, they had more than 30 programs of various parapsychological powers to be applied for military use, including people who would go out of body to go and spy on others, to influence others. And it happened from the US side. They went out of the body and bumped into these people out of body, and they chased each other back and forth. And on the US side, they were afraid to declare because they said if we say we had an experience like that, the military would throw us out as crazy. On the other side, on the Russian side, they would document everything. Oh, we bumped into those people. They are spying on us equally. So here was the difference between a more mystical culture hiding under the guise of this very rational and reductionist viewpoint, and the other side which was afraid to speak. But the moment the communist control ended, you found this huge burst of religion. According to the teaching of Marx, religion was an opium of the masses. It should have been exterminated after 3 generations. What you saw instead was a resurgence and more powerful, and a whole realm of occult and other teachings which surged up. And the reason is this: because science stops and you know there is more, and now you look for it. So the third form is new religions that come up. And the fourth is the profounder seekings after the infinite and the divine. And that's where, through this little gateway called yoga, which at least in the West has been reduced to purely physical exercises. And yet, as a body of knowledge, it opens out to something larger. Through this little gateway, an entry is being made all around the world. And hopefully, bit by bit, a few will cross to some deeper realms. But we are at this very interesting transition point of history where the most material has failed, the age of extreme materialism of science has ended, and there is an opening now to a greater science, at least a seeking for a greater science. And we are just in that transition. There is still the momentum of the past, which is resisting in the public mind. There's a resistance to associate science with these things. But in the public interest, the experience has gone so far that I have seen in the US, they have conferences which are only in appearance scientific. The bulk of it is this highly subjective space. Using vocabulary of science, they will speak of quantum weirdness, quantum entanglement. Once you've thrown those catchwords, you can put in anything you want. Because quantum entanglement says things across a distance are connected. And now you can talk of all kinds of occult, spiritual, and subjective things and make a big mishmash. As long as you declare it quantum entanglement, you are scientific. So it's interesting to see how that transition takes place. But if we understand the rationale behind, you can see why it happens and where it goes. Eventually, and perhaps more valuably, towards profounder seekings after the infinite and the divine. The knowledge of our superficial mentality and the laws of our bodily life is not enough. It brings us always to that mysterious and hidden depth of subjective existence below and behind, of which our surface consciousness is only a fringe or an outer court. And why is this so? Because we are all these things within, below, behind, and of course above as soul. So the superficial mentality and laws of bodily life will always bring to that mysterious and hidden depth of subjective existence below and behind. Why does he use the word below and behind? Why not simply something beyond? These are two very distinct directions, below and behind. The realm which is behind is of the same grade of your bodily life and the superficial mentality, of the same grade of consciousness, but opening to larger possibilities. For example, possibilities of the mind, possibilities of intuition, possibilities, as I said, of subtle senses or remote viewings, out of body experience. They are all of the same grade, but opening out to something wider. So it is behind. In consciousness, not higher. When you go in an out of body experience, your mind consciousness is still the same. Maybe a wider, freer, but still the same ego with the same fear, with the same limitations. But when you go above into a higher state of consciousness, you are fundamentally different as consciousness, as person, and therefore in the quality of the experience. So behind is what Sri Aurobindo uses the word inner mind, inner vital, which only opens out eventually to the whole universe. Below is that realm which is subconscious, below the conscious, and can even reach possibilities which do not operate in the same grade of consciousness. So we have a lot of subconscious impulses which may emerge from below, which can hold as a storehouse all kinds of complexities. One of the things we see often is in illnesses, that there are subconscious sources, things stuck in the past, which prevent you from being able to get free or healed of some problem. And they are at a grade where you cannot be conscious, and they are below conscious. Even it can go to a point where there are things which relate to a past life injury, a hint of which or an influence of which can carry over into the next. And so there's a whole realm which is below and a whole realm which is behind. mysterious and hidden depth of subjective existence, of which our surface consciousness is only a fringe or an outer court. This is one of the key experiences in the yogic awakening, that we discover our own consciousness as so much freer and larger, that what we used to be associated with earlier is so narrow, just a superficial layer. We come to see that what is present to our physical senses is only the material shell of cosmic existence. And what is obvious in our superficial mentality is only the margin of immense continents which lie behind unexplored. So, this is really the direction that science takes as it wakes up beyond narrow materialism. You can call it an occult science or further a spiritual science. What it recognizes is, at a physical level where we were in the body, we see the world and all this appearance is just a shell. Behind it are tremendous powers. Even on a very physical level, when we speak of nuclear energy as a tremendous energy hidden in an atom, it's a first glimpse that what we thought as matter as merely this solid appearance contains something so humongously large as energy. In a single atom or a few atoms splitting is the whole power of the atomic bomb. You know what that is? It's only a few atoms which have been released into the full energy. All the rest are dissipated and broken. And if in a few so much can be held, what is the power behind? By what laws is that power held, or how do they operate? We push a little further, not in the material realm now, but in the domain of our mind, in the superficial mentality. We discover behind powers which are conscious. You can call on them, you can interact with them, you can build relationships with them, and they respond like beings. But as beings, they are gigantic. An entire cyclone system can be being. The entire ocean can be related to as a being. And the whole movement of the tides can be seen as movements of that being. Or the flow of the air and the storm and the wind can be known as beings, and you can relate to them. And I recall, again, reading in the literature of some of these early remote viewers, because for them, they were just entering this world. It was too incomprehensible. One of them describes how one day, as he was in the state of some kind of an interiorized state for remote viewing, he felt distinctly the wind come from the west. And the wind as a being came and told him, I am bringing rains tomorrow. He looks at the sky and there's nothing there, no sign. It's not the time for it to rain. And of course, the next day the wind came strongly and there was rain. But that was the physical wind and the physical cloud and rain. What he had met was the being, which was much larger than the physical little patch of wind and cloud. He spread out and reached ahead of the physical body movement and informed a person who was willing to listen. He sensed either it was he was speaking to all and a few heard, or he recognized here's someone who's awake and told him. We don't know the details. We are entering a field which we don't know enough about, isn't it? But you can still apply your reason and rational mind and explore the field with rational tools, recognizing that some of these things are at a level which is not simply rational. As human relationships cannot be reduced to mere logic, and yet they can be described in rational terms, and you can relate to these large beings, ask their help, or all these possibilities open you out to a huge, and he uses this word, immense continents which lie behind unexplored. In the Mahabharata, there are descriptions of weapons which are given, and they're often given in the form of a mantra or a capacity or a power of energy which is infused in the person to whom it is given. And the person now is traveling without anything in his hands, and on the battlefield, he takes his bow and arrow, which are his primary physical weapons, takes the arrow and invokes now this higher weapon. And when he releases it, it produces an immense tornado, or evokes rain, or creates fire. It looks magical. It is magic from a certain perspective. But from the other side, it's an occult power. It's a weapon which has been released. And there's one particular weapon, the Brahmastra, which is the most terrible, the most intense. When that is released, there is as if the light of 10,000 suns. That's the brilliance. The earth shakes, and the elephants are thrown in the air by the shock of the earth shaking. And then there are passages which describe skin becoming black, nails falling out, hair falling, which are typical signs of radiation poisoning. People go and wash themselves in the water of the river to be free of the poison. So, of course, in some of the modern interpreters will say, oh, they had nuclear weapons. It doesn't work, because if you see a nuclear weapon, even the most advanced today, the smallest, the size of a suitcase, you still have to lug around and carry. And there are dangers in carrying it. And these are people who are not lugging around for the rest of their life a couple of suitcases of nuclear weapons. What are they doing? The weapon itself is the knowledge and the power of the knowledge and the force in the mantra which is granted. And equally, it could be taken back. So some of them had a curse because the person misused his knowledge. The teacher curses him, all right, I curse that when you most need it, you will lose the capacity. And on the battlefield, as he tries to invoke the weapon, he cannot. So what you realize is it has nothing to do with a physical object, and yet its results were similar to a physical process. And what this suggests to the more intuitive mind is that behind all physical processes, including processes of physics, atomic, molecular, are powers which are inherently cosmic powers, because the same process happens everywhere. But as conscious cosmic powers, you can invoke those powers and produce those results or modify those results. And so somebody with that knowledge or that capacity can actually invoke that cosmic energy and produce its action, which will be similar to a physical process producing the same result. And all this opens out to, just this idea opens out to something so extraordinary as to boggle the mind. It means anything you can do by technological means can be replicated by a direct means of consciousness intervening by occult or spiritual ability. Equally, it suggests that anything you could do by occult or subtler means can be replicated by a physical process, not as easily perhaps, but certainly in essence, in form at least. And so it means a whole realm of possibilities now and a whole new science to explore. How far can it go? Sri Aurobindo writes in The Life Divine that the current focus of science is to look at distinctions. So here is flower, biological tissue, and here is stone. What's the difference? Here the molecules are such, atoms are such, here it's like that. The focus is on difference. And he says if science were to concentrate on similarities, it would open to a whole new aspect of powers of science. So what is it that is common between this and this? And if you can get to the common thing, then you see how the common becomes here this and there that. And once you have that link, you can take this object and transmute into that, or that into this. And so he says the result of that knowledge will be the greatest power of science over matter, which is the ability to transmute one substance into another. And it will be a whole domain of science which is yet to be developed. Now, all this I'm explaining because it makes us understand this sense of Sri Aurobindo's statement that whatever we saw in our superficial mentality is only the margin of immense continents. In relation to what we have, to what is waiting, what we have touched is just the most superficial layer, margin only. which lie behind unexplored. To explore them must be the work of another knowledge than that of physical science or of a superficial psychology. Now, the science itself has to undergo a change. It becomes either another science, we give to it a new name, occult science, or spiritual science. Or science itself has to give up its physical science limitation and go on and embrace a larger science. So Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, in fact, in other texts. He speaks of how the Newtonian science gave way to the quantum science and the paradigm shift which occurs. And that's a good step, but it's not yet it. This has to give way to something deeper, which will be the beginning of a new science or the true science. All this we come from the recognition of these two very different perspectives. There's the very narrow material perspective, which is that. And then there is this, which is the soul that looks at the full realm of the worlds and the human being and the planes in the human being. And here we realize the problem of the lower perspective. What held it bound? What prevented it from going deeper? How then can it go deeper? So the next paragraph, which we will take up next Friday, he describes how religion is the first attempt of man to get beyond himself and beyond the obvious and material facts of his existence. What does religion do? What does it lead to? What is the utility of religion in evolution? The recognition of a soul which is different from the body, that the soul has other possibilities, and so on. But from there, what happens next? The truth behind the religion, and as the religious form itself tends to degrade, what is this deeper possibility? And that's what he will describe, which will be for the next couple of paragraphs. And the knowledge of the inner regions of the vital, inner regions of the mental, and all these, where they lead to even the possibility of non-physical experiences and exploration of those domains of each plane. How then can the consciousness, that is the person, the Purusha, the person who is in the body, who feels I am a product of the body, how can this consciousness begin to now disengage and be free of this exclusive identification? And that will be the end of the chapter. We'll pause here and we can take up any questions or comments. You see here the justification of the reductionist physical science. Because if you look at the world only through these newborn physical sight and physical body, that's all that you can see. But the moment you wake up to something deeper, you begin to look also deeper at reality. And that sequence is inevitable. So you see here the description is valid not only in an individual's growth from your birth onward, it is equally valid for a growth of a whole culture or civilization, which may start with a very materialistic orientation and outgrow it. As you can see in, as I said, the communist societies which have crossed over now to something more. We see the same pattern in China today, a sudden turn towards religion, yoga, occultism. And interestingly, the Communist Party, recognizing that it cannot control this, has only kept one rule. You can follow any religion you like, but it should not threaten the state. Your religion is your private practice in your home, and it must be Chinese, it should not be extra-national. So they created Chinese Buddhism, Chinese yoga, Chinese whatever. As long as it's packaged within that and control of the identity which they have to protect, it's fine. And stays in your personal space. No public demonstrations of any kind. Not realizing that in the very process, the consciousness changes. And at some point when the consciousness outgrows this very narrow framework, it will as if push the boundaries and break the boundaries. How long that takes, to be seen. But you can see the first signs in Hong Kong, where the boundaries are already too suffocating. There was already a wider freedom, and the state tried to compress it back to the level of the mainland, and it's resisting and pushing back. The fact that it pushes back here creates a ripple effect in mainland, which is what the party fears. But at the end of the day, this is the point Sri Aurobindo makes, because we are first and foremost soul, it has to push back. And the longer you keep it suppressed, the more intense and violent the pushback and the transition. So this is true not only in cultures and civilizations, it's true of the whole of humanity in its phase, which it has passed through a very materialistic scientific phase. It's equally true of individuals. And so the key to our progress and our full freedom of action is this ascent of consciousness, which is the whole focus of this chapter and the next. So we'll continue with this next Friday. For now, we can dwell on this idea and the shift of perspective that it brings. Oh.